They feel your absence more than you think. The moment you stop looking for them, something shifts. Something subtle, but powerful. The silence you leave behind begins to echo in their mind. Not loudly at first, but persistently. Like a question they can't quite answer. Like a presence they suddenly realize is no longer there. Because you see, people don't always value what is constantly available. They grow used to it. Comfortable. Certain that no matter what happens, you will still be there, reaching out, checking in, showing interest, making the effort. And when that effort disappears, they notice. Not immediately in words, but in feeling. A strange emptiness begins to form. A quiet curiosity. They start to wonder, why haven't you called? Why haven't you texted? Why have you suddenly gone quiet? And just like that, the dynamic changes. In the philosophy of Stoicism, there is a powerful truth. The more you chase, the less you are valued. But the moment you regain control of your attention, your energy, your presence, you become something rare. Something felt. Something missed. When you stop looking for them, you are not playing games. You are stepping back into your own power. You are choosing self-respect over validation. You are choosing peace over constant pursuit. And this creates impact. Because now, instead of you wondering about them, they begin to wonder about you. They replay past conversations in their mind. They think about the moments you shared. They question whether they took you for granted. They start to feel the gap you once filled so effortlessly. Your absence becomes louder than your presence ever was. This is not manipulation. It is awareness. It is understanding human nature. People are drawn to what feels scarce, to what they might lose, to what no longer chases them. And when you stop looking for someone, you give them the space to feel your worth. In this video, you will understand exactly what they feel when you pull back, when you stop chasing, when you choose yourself. You will see how silence speaks, how absence creates attraction, and how, by doing less, you can mean more. Because sometimes, the strongest message you can send is no message at all. The initial confusion they experience. At first, they don't understand what's happening. Everything felt predictable before. You were consistent. You showed up. You reached out. You made your presence known without hesitation. In their mind, that became normal. Expected. Almost guaranteed. And then suddenly, nothing. No message. No call. No effort. It throws them off balance. They check their phone more often than usual, even if they won't admit it. They scroll through past conversations, trying to find a clue. Did something go wrong? Did they miss something? Did they say something that pushed you away? But the truth is, they're not used to this version of you. They're used to the version that stayed. The version that tried. The version that made things easy for them. Now they are faced with uncertainty. And uncertainty creates tension in the mind. They begin to question their assumptions about you. About the connection. About their control in the situation. Because whether they realized it or not, they were comfortable knowing you were always there. Now that certainty is gone. And that's where the shift begins. Because when someone no longer understands your behavior, they start paying attention to it. Your silence becomes noticeable. Your absence becomes meaningful. What used to feel ordinary, now feels different. And difference attracts focus. This confusion is not loud or dramatic. It's quiet. Internal. It sits in the back of their mind throughout the day. While they're busy, while they're distracted, while they're doing other things, you cross their mind. Not because you said something, but because you didn't. And that's the power of stepping back. You interrupt the pattern they were used to. You remove the predictability they relied on. And in doing that, you become something they can no longer ignore. Because people rarely question what is consistent. But they always question what suddenly changes. And right now, you've become that change. The silence starts to bother them more than they expect. After the confusion comes something deeper, discomfort. At first, they try to act normal. They tell themselves it's nothing serious. Maybe you're busy. Maybe you're distracted. Maybe you just needed space. They try to rationalize it in a way that protects their ego, because admitting the truth would mean accepting that your attention actually mattered more than they thought. But silence has a way of growing. It starts small, almost unnoticeable. A moment where they instinctively reach for their phone to text you, then stop. A moment where something happens in their day and their first thought is to tell you, then they remember you haven't been around. A moment where they check your profile without meaning to, just to confirm what they already know. You are not showing up the way you used to. And slowly, that absence begins to sit heavier in their mind. Because now, they are not just noticing your absence, they are feeling it. There is a difference between knowing someone is not talking to you, and emotionally feeling their absence. At this stage, curiosity turns into irritation. Not anger, but a subtle emotional discomfort. The kind that makes them restless without knowing exactly why. They start to replay your presence in their life. The conversations. The attention. The consistency. And now it feels quieter than it used to. That quietness becomes the problem. Because the human mind doesn't respond well to sudden emotional gaps. When something that once filled a space is removed, the brain tries to understand what replaced it. And in this case, nothing has. Just silence. And silence forces reflection. They begin to compare your presence to your absence. And interestingly, absence often becomes louder in memory than presence in real time. Because now, they are no longer taking you for granted. They are evaluating what you actually meant. Questions start forming, even if they don't say them out loud. Why do I feel like something is missing? Why does it feel different now? Why do I keep thinking about them? And the answer they don't want to accept is simple. You mattered more than they acknowledged. This is where emotional tension builds. Not because you are doing anything to them directly, but because your absence is forcing their mind to confront value it ignored before. And this is where Stoicism becomes powerful in understanding human behavior. When you detach your energy from chasing, you are no longer feeding constant reassurance. You are allowing reality to speak for itself. And reality, in silence, becomes very honest. Because now they are sitting with their thoughts, without your presence softening them. And slowly, something begins to shift again. Not outwardly yet, but internally. They start to miss the way things used to feel when you were there. When curiosity turns into miss you energy. At this point, something subtle but powerful begins to happen inside them, and they may not even realize it immediately. What started as confusion, and then discomfort, slowly transforms into curiosity that won't leave them alone. Now they are no longer just noticing your absence. They are thinking about you without being forced to. Your name appears in their mind at random moments. Not because they want it to, but because the brain naturally returns to what once felt emotionally significant. And this is where the shift becomes undeniable. They start to reconstruct you in their memory. Not just who you are, but how you made them feel. The attention you gave. The effort you showed. The consistency that once felt normal. All of it begins to gain new meaning in hindsight. Because when something is no longer present, the mind has a way of upgrading its importance. They remember small things they ignored before. A message you sent that they didn't reply to quickly. A conversation they didn't value in the moment. A moment where you showed care, but they were distracted. Now those moments replay differently. Because now, there is silence where you used to be. And silence has a strange emotional effect. It doesn't just remove noise, it amplifies memory. They may find themselves checking their phone more often than usual. Not because they expect a message, but because part of them still hopes for one. Even if they won't admit it. And when nothing comes, that hope quietly turns into longing. Not loud longing. Not dramatic. But a steady emotional pull they can't fully explain. This is where your absence becomes emotionally active. You are no longer just someone they knew. You become someone they think about. And that shift is powerful. Because thinking about someone repeatedly creates emotional familiarity again, even in their absence. The brain begins to associate your presence with comfort, attention, and emotional engagement. Now they start asking themselves questions they didn't consider before. Why do I keep thinking about them? Why does it feel like something is missing? Did I take them for granted? Will they ever come back? And even if they don't express these thoughts, they sit with them privately. This is where Stoic detachment reveals its strength. Because when you stop chasing, you are not losing control, you are actually regaining it. You are allowing space for natural emotional reflection to take place without interference. And in that space, attraction doesn't disappear. It transforms. From expectation to curiosity. From curiosity to emotional awareness. And now, they begin to realize something they didn't expect. Your absence is starting to feel louder than your presence ever was. And that realization changes everything quietly inside them. The moment they start questioning your value. Now something deeper begins to happen, not on the surface, but inside their thinking. The mind moves from curiosity into reflection. And reflection, when it lingers long enough, becomes evaluation. They start asking themselves questions they never needed to ask before. Not because someone told them to, but because your absence is forcing their attention inward. At first, it is subtle. They remember how easy it was when you were present. The attention, the consistency, the way you checked in without hesitation. Back then, it didn't feel like anything special. It felt normal. Expected. Maybe even taken for granted. But now that it's gone, it starts to look different in hindsight. And this is where human psychology reveals something very important. People don't fully recognize value in real time. They recognize it when access is reduced. So now they begin to reassess you. Not just as a person, but as an experience. They think about the way you made them feel seen. The way you created emotional stability without demanding anything in return. The way your presence filled gaps they didn't even notice existed. And slowly, a realization starts forming. You were actually more important than I thought. But they won't say it out loud. Not immediately. Instead, it stays in their thoughts, repeating in different forms. They may even try to distract themselves. Stay busy. Talk to other people. Engage in other things. But every distraction still leaves small gaps where your memory returns. Because the truth is, you were part of their emotional rhythm. And when something becomes part of someone's rhythm, removing it creates imbalance. Now they start noticing that imbalance. They feel it in small moments. When something reminds them of you. When something funny happens and they instinctively want to share it. When they see something you used to talk about. And in those moments, the question becomes stronger. Why did they stop talking to me? But behind that question is another one they won't easily admit. Did I lose something valuable? This is where your absence begins to carry weight. Not because you are doing anything new, but because you are no longer doing what they expected. An expectation is powerful. When someone expects your presence and it stops, the brain automatically searches for meaning. So now they begin to analyze the past. They replay conversations. They look for signs. They try to understand when things shifted. Whether they missed something. Whether they should have acted differently. And in that reflection, your image becomes clearer again. Not as someone chasing them, but as someone who once showed consistent value. And this is where emotional contrast forms. Because now they are comparing two versions of reality. The version where you were always available, and they didn't think much of it. And the version where you are gone, and suddenly feel important. That contrast creates internal discomfort. Because it forces them to admit something uncomfortable. They didn't value you at the level they should have. And now, the absence is teaching them that lesson. Not through words, but through silence. And that silence begins to reshape how they see you entirely. Because when someone realizes they may have underestimated your value, their mind doesn't forget it easily. It sits there, growing, quietly changing how they feel every time your name crosses their thoughts. When regret starts to sink in silently, at this stage, something heavier begins to settle inside them. It is no longer just curiosity. It is no longer just reflection. It is something deeper, something more uncomfortable. Regret. But not the loud kind of regret that comes with apologies or immediate action. This is the quiet kind. The kind that sits in the background of their thoughts throughout the day. The kind that shows up when they are alone, when distractions are low, when their mind finally has space to think clearly. And in that space, you appear. Not as a passing thought anymore, but as a presence they can't easily ignore. They start remembering how available you were. How consistent you were. How you showed up without them having to ask too much. At the time, it felt normal to them. Maybe even expected. But now, in your absence, it starts to look like something different. Something valuable. Something they may have overlooked. And that realization creates discomfort. Because the mind naturally compares past and present. It looks at what was there, and what is missing now. And the contrast is sharp. Before there was access to you. Your attention. Your energy. Your effort. Now there is silence. And silence does not just feel empty, it feels meaningful. They begin to replay moments in their mind with new interpretation. A message they didn't respond to properly. A moment they were too distracted to appreciate. A time they assumed you would always be there. And now those same moments carry weight. Because hindsight changes perception. What once seemed ordinary now feels important. What once felt guaranteed now feels uncertain. What once felt available now feels gone. And this is where regret slowly takes shape. Not in a dramatic way, but in subtle emotional flashes. A sudden thought during the day. A memory that appears without warning. A feeling of, I should have done better. They may even try to suppress it, to act like it doesn't matter, to convince themselves that everything is fine. But the mind doesn't let go that easily, because your absence has created a space that something else would normally fill, but it hasn't been filled. And that emptiness becomes a reminder of what used to be there, a reminder of what they had access to, a reminder of what they no longer have. This is where Stoic detachment becomes powerful in understanding the situation. Because when you stop chasing, you remove emotional noise. You stop over-explaining your worth. You stop over-giving your presence to those who don't fully value it. And in that space of withdrawal, truth begins to surface. They start to see you differently. Not as someone always available, but as someone who actually had value that was not fully appreciated at the time. And regret grows strongest when it is attached to lost access. Because people don't just miss you. They miss the version of life they had when you were still there. And that realization begins to change how they feel about you on a deeper level. Not loudly, but permanently shaping their thoughts every time your absence is felt. When their pride starts to fight their feelings. At this point, something interesting happens inside them. A silent internal battle begins. On one side, there is the growing feeling of missing you. The memories. The thoughts. The realization that your presence meant more than they admitted. But on the other side, there is pride. And pride does not give up easily. So even as they start to feel your absence more deeply, they try to resist it. They try to convince themselves that it is not that serious. That they are fine. That they are not affected. That they are not thinking about you as much as they actually are. But the truth is, they are thinking about you more than they want to admit. And this contradiction creates tension inside them. Because feelings are pulling them in one direction, while ego is pushing them in another. So instead of reaching out, they delay it. Instead of admitting they miss you, they distract themselves. Instead of acknowledging the emotional gap, they try to replace it with noise. Social media. Conversations. New interactions. Anything that keeps them from sitting too long with their thoughts. But no matter how much they distract themselves, there are still quiet moments. And in those quiet moments you return. Not because you are forcing your way into their mind, but because your absence created a space that still hasn't been filled. And now that space feels more noticeable than before. This is where the mind starts to rationalize. They begin to tell themselves stories to protect their ego. Maybe I didn't care that much anyway. Maybe it's better this way. Maybe I'm just used to the attention. But deep down, those statements don't fully convince them. Because if it truly didn't matter, they wouldn't keep thinking about you. And that is where the conflict grows stronger. They start remembering the good moments again, but quickly try to dismiss them. They catch themselves checking their phone, then stop. They think about reaching out, then hesitate. And that hesitation reveals everything. Because when someone is truly unaffected, there is no hesitation. But when feelings are present, hesitation becomes constant. Now they are stuck in a loop. Missing you, but not wanting to admit it. Thinking about you, but not wanting to act on it. Feeling your absence, but trying to appear unaffected. And this is where emotional pressure builds quietly. Not in dramatic actions, but in internal unrest. They may seem normal on the outside, but inside, there is a pull they cannot fully explain. And the more they resist it, the stronger it feels. Because resistance does not remove emotion, it amplifies awareness of it. This is where Stoic detachment reveals its deeper effect. When you step back completely, you are no longer feeding emotional certainty. You are no longer giving them predictable access to your attention. You are no longer reinforcing their assumption that you will always be available. And in that space of unpredictability, their mind begins to work harder. To understand you. To remember you. To feel you. And slowly, pride begins to lose its grip just enough for emotion to slip through. Not fully yet, but enough that they start to wonder something they didn't want to ask before. Do I actually miss them more than I'm willing to admit? And that question alone changes everything internally. When silence starts to rewire their emotions. At this stage, something deeper than thoughts begins to shift. It is no longer just mental reflection or emotional resistance. It becomes conditioning. Your absence starts to rewire how they emotionally respond to everyday moments. Because when someone is consistently present in your life, your mind builds a pattern around them. You expect their replies. You expect their attention. You expect their energy to be part of your normal emotional environment. But when that pattern breaks, the mind doesn't immediately adapt. Instead, it keeps expecting what is no longer coming. And that expectation turns into emotional echo. They reach for their phone, and pause. They hear something interesting, and instinctively think of you. They go through their day, and notice something feels slightly off. Not because anything is happening externally, but because internally, a connection point is missing. This is where silence becomes powerful. Because silence is not empty to the mind. Silence becomes a signal. A reminder. A space where thoughts that were once pushed aside are now free to return. And you begin to occupy that space more frequently. Not because you are doing anything new, but because you are no longer interrupting the space with your presence. And that absence changes emotional patterns. They start associating certain moods, moments, and experiences with you again. Things that used to feel normal now feel slightly incomplete without sharing them with you. Even simple things become triggers. A song. A time of day. A random memory. A phrase someone says. And each trigger brings your presence back into their awareness. This is how emotional rewiring begins. Slowly. Repeatedly. Quietly. At first, they try to ignore it. They push it away. They convince themselves it's just habit. Just routine. Just coincidence. But the repetition weakens that resistance. Because the mind starts to connect a pattern. When something happens, they think of you. When they think of you, nothing happens back. No message. No response. No confirmation. Just silence again. And that loop creates emotional tension. Because now, your presence is being felt without being fulfilled. And unfulfilled emotional expectations are one of the strongest forces in human psychology. This is where missing you becomes less of a thought, and more of a reaction. They don't always choose to think about you. It just happens. And the more it happens, the more natural it becomes. Until eventually, they stop being surprised by it. They start accepting it quietly. And that acceptance is important. Because it means you are no longer just a memory they can control. You are now a consistent emotional presence in their mind, even in your absence. And this is where Stoic detachment shows its true impact. Not in forcing feelings, but in allowing space for reality to reveal feelings on its own. Because when you stop chasing, you stop interrupting their emotional processing. And when you stop interrupting it, their mind begins to process you more deeply than before. And that is when missing you stops being occasional and starts becoming a pattern they cannot easily escape. when they start fighting the urge to reach out. Now something shifts again, and this time, it is no longer just about thinking or feeling. It becomes action resistance. Because at this stage, they are not just aware of your absence, they are actively struggling with what to do about it. There are moments where everything inside them pushes toward you. A message forms in their mind. A sentence they could send. A reason they could use to break the silence. It feels easy in those moments, almost natural. Like nothing ever changed. But right before they act on it, something stops them. Pride. Ego. Uncertainty. Fear of how you will respond. And just like that, the moment passes. But it doesn't disappear. It lingers. Because once the idea of reaching out enters the mind, it doesn't fully leave. It stays in the background, returning again and again at different times of the day. And each time it returns, it feels slightly stronger. They tell themselves they are fine without doing it. They try to convince themselves that it is unnecessary. That enough time has passed. That if it was important, you would have reached out instead. But the truth is, they are using logic to suppress emotion. And emotion does not stay suppressed forever. There are moments when they check your profile without intending to. Moments when they read old messages again. Moments when they replay conversations in their head and imagine what it would feel like if you responded again. And in those moments, the urge becomes louder. Because your absence is no longer just something they notice. It is something they are now reacting to. They may even start drafting messages they never send. Deleting them. Rewriting them. Hesitating over simple words. Trying to find the right time, or the right approach. But the real issue is not timing. It is internal conflict. One part of them wants reconnection. Another part wants control. And both are fighting for dominance. This is where silence becomes pressure. Because every day that passes without communication makes the gap feel both larger and more noticeable. Not because distance increases, but because uncertainty increases. They start wondering if it is already too late. They start wondering if you have moved on emotionally. They start wondering if reaching out will change anything. And those questions slow them down even more. But at the same time, they cannot fully detach. Because if they truly didn't care, there would be no hesitation. No repeated thoughts. No internal debates. No emotional discomfort. Instead, there would be indifference. And what they are experiencing is far from indifference. It is emotional tension held back by ego. This is where Stoic withdrawal creates its strongest effect. Because when you stop chasing, you remove reassurance. You remove easy access. You remove emotional predictability. And in that absence, their mind begins to fill the gap with imagination. They start imagining you differently. What you are doing now. Who you are talking to. Whether you still think about them. Whether you've already moved forward. And that imagination is powerful, because it is not grounded in certainty. It is built on silence. And silence gives no answers. Only space. And in that space, emotions grow louder. Until eventually, reaching out stops being just an option. And starts becoming something they constantly think about, even if they still don't act on it. Because the urge is no longer random. It is becoming consistent. When they realize you are not coming back the same way. At this stage, something shifts that they didn't expect to face. It is no longer just missing you. It is no longer just thinking about you. It is the slow realization that your energy is no longer flowing toward them the way it used to. and that changes everything internally. Because deep down, they were operating with an unspoken assumption that even if you go quiet, even if you pull back, even if there is distance, you would still be accessible in the same way. Still reachable. Still available. Still familiar. But now, the silence has lasted long enough to create doubt. And doubt is where emotional instability begins. They start to question not only what you are doing, but what you are becoming. Are you moving on? Are you changing? Are you no longer emotionally attached the way you once were? These thoughts don't always come in a clear sentence. Sometimes they come as feelings. A sudden discomfort when they think of you. A strange heaviness when your name crosses their mind. A subtle irritation that they cannot fully explain. Because what used to feel like you are always there is now being replaced by you are no longer predictable. And unpredictability changes emotional perception. Now they begin to observe you differently in their mind. Your absence is no longer just absence. It starts to feel like distance that is widening emotionally, not just physically. And that creates a new layer of tension. Because one of the hardest things for the mind to accept is losing emotional control over someone it once had access to. So they begin to analyze again. Did I lose them? Did I push too far? Did I assume too much? Did I take their presence for granted? And with each question, certainty decreases. At the same time, your silence is no longer being interpreted as simple absence. It is being interpreted as a decision. A choice. And that is what makes it more powerful. Because silence that looks accidental is easy to ignore. But silence that feels intentional, that feels like distance being chosen, that creates emotional weight. Now they start to imagine scenarios that they cannot confirm. Maybe you are focusing on yourself. Maybe you are talking to new people. Maybe you no longer feel the same way. Maybe you have emotionally detached completely. And the mind does something interesting here. It tries to fill missing information with possibility. And possibility often leans toward fear. Because uncertainty without reassurance always pushes the mind toward worst-case thinking. And that is where your absence becomes louder than ever before. Not because you are doing more, but because you are doing nothing. And in that nothing, they start to feel the loss of access. Not just access to conversation, but access to you emotionally. And this is where Stoic detachment becomes extremely visible in effect. Because you are no longer reacting to their expectations. You are no longer reinforcing their assumption that they can reach you anytime and receive the same emotional availability. You have stepped out of that cycle. And now they are left adjusting to a version of reality where you are not emotionally predictable anymore. And that adjustment is not comfortable. Because people adapt quickly to availability, but struggle deeply with its removal. So now, they are forced to confront something they avoided earlier. The possibility that your attention is no longer something they can rely on. And that realization doesn't create noise. It creates internal emptiness. A quiet emotional gap that they can no longer ignore. And that gap slowly turns into something more persistent. A sense that losing you is no longer just a thought. It is becoming a reality they are starting to feel. When their ego finally starts to break down. At this point, something very important happens internally, even if they try hard not to show it. The ego starts to lose its strength. Not all at once, not dramatically, but gradually, through pressure they can no longer fully control. Because they have spent so much time trying to act unaffected, trying to stay composed, trying to convince themselves that your absence is not a big deal, That now, the emotional weight has built up quietly underneath all of that. And when something builds up in silence for too long, it eventually becomes hard to contain. So now, the same person who once felt confident that you would always be there starts experiencing moments of emotional instability. Not outwardly obvious, but internally noticeable. They begin to think about you more honestly now. Without filters. Without ego trying to protect them. Without pride trying to rewrite the story. And the thoughts become more direct. I actually miss them. I shouldn't have let it get to this point. I think I underestimated them. These are not thoughts they say out loud. These are thoughts they only face when they are alone, when distractions are gone, when silence becomes too loud to ignore. Because ego only stays strong when there is constant validation. But your absence removed that validation. You are no longer reacting. No longer chasing. No longer reinforcing their importance in your life. And that creates a shift they did not prepare for. Now they are no longer in control of how they are perceived in your life. And that loss of control creates discomfort. So the ego tries one last defense. It tries to convince them that they are still fine without you. That they don't need to reach out. That they are doing better than they actually feel. But the emotional truth keeps breaking through. Because no matter how much they try to suppress it, your absence keeps appearing in their thoughts at random moments. And each time it appears, it feels a little more real. A little more personal. A little more difficult to ignore. They start remembering how naturally things flowed when you were still present. How easy communication was. How consistent attention felt. And now, in contrast, everything feels different. Not necessarily worse on the outside, but emptier on the inside. And that emptiness is what slowly weakens pride. Because pride cannot fully replace emotional connection. It can delay action. It can delay admission. It can delay vulnerability. But it cannot erase feeling. So now, even when they try to maintain distance, something in them keeps pulling back toward you mentally. They may reopen old chats. Revisit old memories. Look at things you once said differently now. Not with dismissal, but with interpretation. And interpretation always leads back to one conclusion. You mattered more than they acknowledged at the time. And that realization is what starts to dissolve the ego from within. Because the ego depends on the idea that they were always in control of the dynamic. But your silence challenges that belief. Your absence introduces uncertainty. And uncertainty is what slowly breaks down emotional arrogance. Now they are no longer just thinking about you occasionally. They are starting to feel the impact of losing access to you emotionally. And that is where the internal shift becomes undeniable. Because once ego begins to weaken, feelings start to take its place more openly. And what was once hidden beneath pride begins to surface as genuine emotional awareness. They don't fully admit it yet, but they are no longer indifferent. They are emotionally affected. And that is the point where your absence stops being just noticeable and starts becoming something they can no longer emotionally ignore. When they start to feel replaceable and it hits their pride. At this stage, the emotional impact changes shape again. It is no longer just about missing you. It is no longer just about regret or ego breaking down. Now it becomes something more uncomfortable. The fear of being replaceable. Because once your absence lasts long enough, their mind naturally starts to fill in the unknown with imagination. And imagination, when mixed with ego, can become emotionally painful. They begin to wonder, without you saying anything at all. Are you talking to someone else? Are you giving your attention to someone new? Have you already moved on emotionally? Have they been replaced in your thoughts the same way they tried to ignore you? And these thoughts don't come with confirmation. They come with silence. And silence gives no reassurance. So their mind starts building scenarios they cannot verify, but cannot ignore either. And that is where emotional pressure intensifies. Because it is one thing to miss someone. It is another thing entirely to imagine that they are no longer missing you. Now the mind begins to replay your past interactions with a different lens. Moments that once felt casual now feel meaningful. Moments they didn't value now feel like opportunities they may have wasted. And the comparison begins. The version of life where you were still present, and the version where you are no longer available. And the difference between those two versions becomes more obvious with time. Because what once felt like normal access to you is now gone. And replacement anxiety starts to build quietly. Not because you told them anything, but because your absence has created uncertainty. And uncertainty is the breeding ground for emotional insecurity. They may try to ignore it again. To act like it doesn't matter. To convince themselves that they are still in control emotionally. But deep down, something shifts. They start checking things more often than they should. Your profile. Your activity. Any small sign that might give them information about where you are emotionally. And every time they find nothing, it confirms nothing. And that lack of confirmation becomes its own emotional trigger. Because the mind prefers pain it can understand over uncertainty it cannot explain. Now they are forced into a new emotional position. They are no longer sure of your availability. No longer sure of your attention. No longer sure of your emotional presence in their life. And that creates a subtle fear. Not panic, but awareness. Awareness that they no longer have the same influence over your attention that they once assumed they did. And that realization affects pride deeply. Because pride is built on perceived importance. And when importance is no longer guaranteed, pride begins to weaken in quiet ways. They may even start to reinterpret your silence as intentional. Not accidental, not casual, but deliberate. A choice. And that interpretation makes your absence feel even more powerful. Because now, it is not just that you are gone. It is that you are choosing not to be present in the same way anymore. And that creates emotional imbalance. Because the dynamic has reversed in their mind. You are no longer the one reaching. You are no longer the one available. You are no longer the predictable presence. You are now the uncertain factor. And uncertain people are the ones the mind thinks about the most. So now, even when they try to focus on other things, your absence still returns in waves. Not loudly, but consistently. And slowly, they begin to feel something they were trying to avoid from the beginning. The possibility that losing you emotionally might already be happening in real time. And that realization doesn't disappear easily. It lingers. And it starts changing how they feel about everything that came before. When they finally start to miss you in a real way, not just ego talk. At this point, the emotions stop being surface level. It is no longer confusion. No longer pride. No longer mental arguments or ego trying to defend itself. Now it becomes something quieter, but deeper. They start to genuinely miss you. Not the idea of you. Not the attention you gave. Not the convenience of your presence. But you. The real emotional space you occupied in their life. And this kind of missing is different. It doesn't always come with a dramatic realization. It doesn't always come with immediate action. It often comes in stillness, in moments where nothing is happening, in moments where their mind finally has space to feel instead of defend. And suddenly you appear in those spaces, not as a passing thought anymore, but as a feeling. They start remembering how your presence made certain moments easier, how conversations felt more alive when you were involved, how your attention created a sense of connection they didn't fully appreciate at the time. And now that it is gone, the contrast becomes undeniable. Because the mind doesn't just remember people. It remembers emotional states, how you made them feel. And now, in your absence, that emotional state is missing. This is where missing you becomes more consistent. They are no longer forcing thoughts about you. It just happens naturally. A random moment in the day. A quiet night. A pause between activities. A song, a place, a memory. And each trigger brings a wave of awareness. You are not here. And that awareness slowly turns into emotional weight. They may try to distract themselves again, but distractions no longer erase the feeling. They only delay it. Because what they are feeling now is not just mental, it is emotional memory reactivating. And emotional memory is powerful. It doesn't fade easily with logic. Now they begin to compare their present emotional state with how things used to feel when you were present. And the comparison is not equal. Something is missing now that was previously effortless. And this realization begins to settle more deeply than before. Because this is the stage where pride is no longer leading the reaction. Emotion is. And when emotion takes the lead, thoughts become more honest. They start to acknowledge things internally they avoided earlier. I actually liked the way things were. I didn't realize how much they mattered. I took their presence for granted. And even if they don't say it out loud, the recognition is there. This is also where the desire to reconnect becomes more natural. Not forced. Not strategic. Not ego-driven. But emotional. They may think about reaching out. Not to win something. Not to prove something. But simply to restore a feeling they lost. And that is a major shift. Because now, your absence is no longer just something they are observing. It is something they are emotionally responding to. And that response is no longer controlled by pride alone. It is influenced by genuine emotional attachment that surfaced after distance. And this is where Stoic detachment shows its full effect. Because by stepping back, you didn't force anything. You simply created space. And in that space, truth began to reveal itself. Slowly. Naturally. Inevitably. Now they are sitting with a feeling they can no longer fully ignore. They miss you in a way that is no longer theoretical, but real. And that realization changes the emotional tone of everything that comes next. When they start idealizing you because of your absence. At this stage, something subtle begins to happen inside their mind, and it changes the way they remember you completely. Your absence is no longer just felt, it is now being interpreted. And interpretation always adds layers that were never there before. They start remembering you differently. Not in fragments. Not in random moments. But in a more complete emotional picture that their mind is now building in hindsight. And the strange thing about human memory is this. When someone is no longer actively present in your life, the mind begins to remove friction and highlight meaning. So now, the little imperfections they once noticed fade into the background. And what remains becomes more polished, more significant, more emotionally charged. They begin to think about you in a more idealized way. Not because you changed, but because their access to you changed. They remember your patience differently now. They remember your attention more clearly now. They remember the way you showed up more vividly now. And all of those memories start to merge into one emotional impression. You were actually better than I realized. But this realization doesn't come immediately with peace. It comes with contrast. Because at the same time they are remembering you more positively, they are also sitting in your absence. And that combination creates emotional tension. Now they are comparing memory with reality. And in memory you feel present. But in reality you are not. That gap becomes noticeable. And the mind doesn't like gaps it cannot fill. So it starts to idealize further. It removes unnecessary negativity from past experiences. It softens misunderstandings. It reinterprets conversations. It focuses more on your consistency than on any small disagreements that may have happened. And slowly, you begin to look more valuable in hindsight than you did in real time. This is where emotional distortion begins. Not in a dishonest way, but in a psychological way. Because distance removes emotional noise, and without noise, the mind highlights meaning. Now they start to feel like something about you was rare. Something about your presence was not easily replaceable. Something about the way you gave attention felt different from others. And that thought becomes difficult to ignore. Because once someone starts seeing you as rare, their emotional attachment to your memory strengthens. Even without contact. Even without communication. Even without new interaction. Your absence is now feeding your presence in their mind. And this is where Stoic detachment creates a very deep shift. Because you are no longer reinforcing your value through action. You are allowing your absence to define it. And in many cases, absence becomes more powerful than presence ever was. Now they start to imagine how it would feel if you returned. How a conversation with you would go now. Whether things would feel the same. Whether you have changed. Whether they still have access to the version of you they remember. And those questions begin to create emotional pull. Because imagination is always stronger when reality is uncertain. And right now, reality is uncertain. So they fill that uncertainty with idealization. And the more they idealize you, the more your emotional presence grows in their mind. Until eventually, they reach a point where they are not just thinking about who you were. They are thinking about what it would mean to lose you completely. And that thought carries emotional weight that is hard to ignore. Because now, you are not just someone they remember. You are someone they are starting to value in a way they didn't before. And that realization begins to shape everything they feel moving forward. When they finally start thinking about reaching out for real. At this stage, the internal resistance they've been holding onto for so long begins to weaken in a noticeable way. It is no longer just thoughts passing through the mind. It is no longer just memories or emotional reactions that come and go. Now it becomes intention. They start seriously considering reaching out. Not casually. Not as a passing idea. But as something that feels increasingly difficult to ignore. Because everything they have gone through up to this point, confusion, silence, regret, pride, missing you, idealization, all of it has built up into one quiet emotional pressure. And that pressure is no longer easy to contain. So now, they begin to imagine what it would actually look like to contact you again. They think about the first message. They think about how you might respond. They think about whether you would even reply at all. They think about how much time has passed and whether it is too late. And this is where hesitation becomes stronger than ego. Because ego says, don't reach out. But emotion says, you need to. And now both are fighting in the same mind. They may open your chat and stare at it without typing anything. They may write a message and delete it. They may type again and pause before sending. They may even rehearse what they would say in their head over and over again. But what is holding them back is no longer indifference. It is uncertainty. Uncertainty about how you see them now. Uncertainty about whether your emotional space for them still exists. Uncertainty about whether the version of you they remember is still accessible. Because in their mind, something has shifted. You are no longer just available in the background. You are now perceived as someone who has potentially moved forward emotionally. And that possibility creates emotional pressure. Because now, reaching out is no longer just about reconnecting. It is about risk. The risk of being ignored. The risk of not getting the same warmth. The risk of realizing that your emotional state has changed completely. And that risk makes them hesitate longer. But at the same time, the desire to reconnect grows stronger. Because your absence is no longer passive. It is active in their emotional awareness. They feel it in moments they don't expect. They think about you when they try not to. They remember things without trying to. And that repetition creates emotional buildup. Until eventually, the thought of reaching out stops being optional in their mind. It becomes something they keep returning to. Again and again. Even when they try to move on with their day, it comes back. Even when they distract themselves, it returns. Even when they convince themselves to wait longer, it still remains present. And this is where the emotional balance shifts completely. Because now, silence is no longer just your action. It is their experience. And that experience is pushing them toward a decision they are not fully ready for, but can no longer ignore. And in that space between hesitation and action, your presence in their mind becomes stronger than ever before. When reality sets in and your silence becomes your power. At this point, everything reaches a quiet but undeniable conclusion inside their mind. They now understand something they resisted from the beginning. Your silence was not emptiness. It was not confusion. It was not something random they could ignore until it passed. It was change. And change is what makes people uncomfortable when they are not in control of it. Because now, the version of you they once had easy access to, is no longer the same version they can assume will always be available. They begin to feel it in a deeper way now. Not just emotionally, but psychologically. The space you used to occupy in their life is no longer being automatically filled by your presence. And that gap forces them to confront reality without distortion. No constant messages. No reassurance. No predictable attention. No emotional certainty. Just distance. And in that distance, something becomes very clear to them. You are not chasing anymore. You are not trying to prove anything anymore. You are not over-explaining your value anymore. And that creates a shift in perception. Because people don't always value intensity. They value absence when it feels intentional. Now they are left with their thoughts, and those thoughts are no longer comfortable. They replay everything from the beginning. How accessible you were. How consistent you were. How easily they assumed you would stay. And now they see it differently. Not as something guaranteed, but as something they took lightly. And that realization doesn't come with noise. It comes with silence. A silence that feels different from the silence they created. Because this silence carries meaning. It carries distance. It carries emotional separation. And now they begin to understand something very important. You were not just someone in their life. You were someone who added emotional structure to their attention. And now that structure is gone. So they sit with the truth they avoided for a long time. Missing you is no longer occasional. It is consistent. Thinking about you is no longer random. It is habitual. And reaching out is no longer just an idea. It is something they keep circling back to emotionally, even if they still haven't acted on it. But by the time they fully realize all of this, something else has also started to form inside them. Uncertainty about you. Because your silence has not only made them miss you, it has made them question whether they still have access to you at all. And that is the final shift. When someone no longer feels certain they can reach you the same way, they begin to value you in a completely different way. Not because you changed loudly, but because you withdrew quietly. And that quiet withdrawal becomes louder than any words ever could.